The boot hit the screen door like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that had been building for years. Nora Callahan didn't flinch. She stood in the driveway with her arms at her sides and watched the door swing back on its hinges, watched it bounce once against the frame and settle into a slow, defeated sway. The sound of it echoed out across the yard and dissolved into the dry Arizona morning like it had never happened at all. Dennis and Kyle were polite about it. That was the worst part. They wore matching khaki polo shirts with a bank logo stitched neatly over the left breast, and they called her ma'am, and they asked twice if she needed help carrying anything to her truck, and they handled her furniture with a careful, professional indifference that made her want to put her fist through something. They were not bad men. She understood that. They were men doing a job they hadn't invented, collecting on a debt they hadn't created, executing a process that had been set in motion 2 years ago by people who were long gone and unreachable. She watched Dennis carry out the rocking chair that her husband Garrett had built in 1989 from a kit he'd ordered out of a catalog. The joints had never been quite right. It had always listed slightly to the left. She had sat in it every evening for 31 years and never once thought about buying a better one. She watched Kyle hoist the dining room table where her daughter Wren had done homework every night for 12 years. The surface still marked with the ghost of a geometry compass that had slipped and gouged the wood when Wren was 14. She watched them stack decades of her existence onto the lawn in neat, patient rows like men clearing inventory from a warehouse. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in 2 years. She wasn't sure she remembered how. What she did instead was walk to the side of the house to the narrow gap between the porch and the old juniper hedge where she had hidden something the night before. She had known they were coming. She'd had the final notice for 6 weeks. She pulled out the leather jacket and held it up in the morning light. It was old. It smelled like oil and road dust, and something underneath that, she couldn't name, some combination of decades and miles and the chemistry of a life spent outdoors. The leather was heavy and cracked at the elbows and stiff along the shoulders in the way that leather gets when it hasn't moved in a long time. Patches covered the back and sleeves. Club patches, event patches. A faded Iron Maiden's crest sewn over the left breast in thread that had once been bright red and was now the color of dried rust. She hadn't worn it in 15 years. Not since the last run she'd taken with the club. Not since she'd sold the shop and tried to convince herself she was someone else now. She put it on. The leather groaned as she slid her arms through the sleeves. It still fit barely. She zipped it halfway and felt the weight settle across her shoulders, and something shifted in her chest, something small and stubborn that she hadn't known was still there. Her name was Nora Callahan. She was 75 years old. She had been riding motorcycles since 1967 when she was 18 years old, and borrowed a neighbor's Honda without asking, and discovered the only thing in the world that made complete, total, unargued sense. She had ridden with 3 different clubs over the decades. She had been among the first women patched into the Iron Maiden's motorcycle club, back when that distinction still cost something, back when it meant fighting for every single mile. She had run Callahan Cycle Works in Prescott, Arizona for 30 years, building a reputation for honest work and deep knowledge of American iron that had brought customers from 4 states. She had also, 3 years ago, signed a document her daughter handed her without reading a single word of it. That was the detail that kept her awake at night. Not the betrayal itself, not even the money. The fact that she had put her name on a piece of paper her own daughter handed her across a kitchen table over coffee in the house she had lived in for 22 years, and she had not read it. She had run a business for 3 decades. She had chased down customers who tried to skip out on labor bills. She had negotiated with parts suppliers twice her size who thought they could shortchange her on orders. She had won disputes with men who were certain a woman didn't understand what she was talking about, and she had proven them wrong with invoices and documentation and the kind of meticulous record-keeping that comes from understanding that the world will find any gap you leave it. And she had signed a document without reading it because her daughter asked her to. Wren had come to her in the spring of 2021 with a story about Rick, about a bad month at his contracting business, a temporary cash flow problem, just a bridge loan to cover things until a project paid out. The numbers she mentioned were not small, but they were not impossible. Nora had believed her because Wren was her daughter, and because she had no particular reason not to, and because she was tired that day, and it was raining, and the coffee was hot, and sometimes a person makes a mistake, not out of foolishness, but out of the ordinary human failure to imagine the worst. Rick Harlan had taken the loan money and lost it at a casino in Laughlin within 6 weeks. Then he had opened a second line of credit in Nora's name using information from the first application. Then a third. He had used the equity in her house as collateral on documents he signed with a version of her signature that was close enough to pass an initial review. He had bled her dry one account at a time over the course of 8 months, and then in March of 2022, he had disappeared. Gone. Out of state, they said later. $30,000 in cash and a woman nobody in Prescott had ever met. Wren had called from somewhere outside Las Vegas 2 weeks after Rick vanished. She said she was fine. She said she didn't know where Rick had gone. She said she was going to figure things out and come back and fix everything. She had sounded frightened in a way that Nora had never heard from her before, a high, thin quality to her voice like something pulled too tight. She never called again. Nora had spent the next 2 years fighting. She hired lawyers she couldn't afford and paid them with money from the sale of her shop, which she sold in the fall of 2022, for 60 cents on the dollar because she needed the cash immediately and couldn't wait for a better offer. She tried to refinance with 3 different lenders. She filed complaints with the county attorney's office about Rick's forgeries. She documented everything, organized everything, presented everything in the careful, methodical way she had always operated. None of it was enough. The documentation of fraud helped establish what had happened, but did not undo what the bank was legally owed. The refinancing fell through because her income no longer supported the payments. The shop money went faster than she expected. By the time the final notice arrived, she had cashed out a retirement account she'd spent 20 years building, sold every significant tool she owned, and was working part-time at a counterpart store for $11 an hour just to keep the electricity on. She was 75 years old, and she was starting from zero. Dennis and Kyle finished loading the truck a little after 11 in the morning. Kyle asked one more time if she needed help with anything. She shook her head. He nodded, looked briefly at his shoes, and climbed into the cab. Dennis paused at the driver's side door and said he was sorry genuinely in the voice of a man who meant it and knew it didn't matter. Then they drove away. Nora stood in the yard for a while looking at the house. 22 years. The garden she'd put in along the south fence. The flagstone path Garrett had laid the summer before he got sick. The marks on the porch door frame where she'd tracked Wren's height every birthday until Wren turned 16 and said she was too old for that. She looked at all of it, and then she turned away. The motorcycle was around back. A 1974 Harley-Davidson Shovelhead Cherry Red, once now faded to something closer to rust with black trim that had seen better decades. It needed work. It always needed work. The carburetor ran rich. The kickstart was stiff. One cylinder had been misfiring since August, and she hadn't had the money or the time to properly diagnose it. But it ran. On a good day it ran, and today she needed it to be a good day. She swung her leg over the seat and settled in. The leather creaked beneath her. She put her boot on the kickstart and pressed down once. Nothing. Twice, a cough, a sputter. On the third kick, the engine caught and opened up into a low rolling thunder that pushed against her chest like a hand. Nora sat there for a moment with the engine running, feeling the vibration move through the frame and into her hands. Then she twisted the throttle once, felt the engine answer, put the bike in gear, and rode. She took the county road north out of town, past the strip mall where she used to buy groceries, past the high school where Wren had played softball 2 seasons, never quite good enough to start, past the cemetery on the east side of the highway where Garrett Callahan had been buried for 17 years under a flat granite marker with nothing on it but his name and the years. She didn't stop at any of it. She kept the throttle steady and let the wind pull the heat out of her skin. The houses thinned. The road climbed. Sagebrush replaced lawns and red rock formations rose on either side, ancient and indifferent, watching the road below them with the patience of things that had been standing there since before anyone thought to name them. The air smelled like dust and juniper and warm asphalt. The engine settled into a rhythm beneath her, rough and reliable and honest, in the way that only old machines can be honest without pretense, without anything to prove. She rode for 40 minutes. She hadn't been out this way in years. The road was the same, the land was the same. The afternoon light hit the rock faces and turned them copper and gold, the shadows falling long and precise across the pale dirt, in the way they always had and always would, regardless of what was happening to the people passing through below them. That was one of the things she had always valued about the desert. It did not adjust itself to accommodate the difficulties of the people moving through it. The pavement gave way to dirt 3 miles past the ridge. The dirt narrowed into a track that wound through scrub oak and tall dry grass. No signs, no markers, just a road she had driven 100 times and not thought about in years, a road her hands and her instincts remembered, even when her mind had been working to set everything connected to it aside. The property sat at the end of the track. 5 acres of Arizona hillside that her grandmother Rosalind Callahan had purchased in 1946 for what amounted to almost nothing. There was no house on it. There had never been a house. There was only one structure, a concrete block garage 20 feet by 40, with a heavy steel roll door and no windows. It sat on a slight rise at the end of the track, surrounded by dry grass and scattered rock. It had been painted white once. Now it was mostly gray. The paint blistered and peeling from decades of sun and wind, the corners stained dark from rain that came rarely but hard when it came. Rosalind Callahan had owned this garage until the morning she died in 1998. She had been 90 years old, sharp as a blade until the very end, her handwriting still precise on the documents she left behind. In her will, she had passed the property to Nora directly, not to Nora's mother, who was still living at the time, not to Nora's older brother Dalt, who had expected it. To Nora, specifically. The will had come with a single instruction, handwritten on a separate piece of notepaper in Rosalind's careful, upright script. Don't open it until you have nothing left. Nora had read that line in a lawyer's office in the fall of 1998 and laughed the short, startled laugh of someone confronting an unexpected absurdity. Her grandmother had always been like that. Deliberate silences, long looks that seemed to be measuring something invisible, a watchfulness that Nora had attributed in her younger years to the reserve of an old woman who had outlived most of the people she'd known. For 26 years, the garage had sat on this hill, and Nora had paid the property taxes on it every year. $180 a year paid out of stubbornness more than anything else, a small insistence on holding on to the one thing she hadn't quite been able to let go of. She had driven out here sometimes over the years. She had stood in front of the steel door with the key in her hand and looked at the lock and then put the key away and left. She had never been out of choices before, not like this. She killed the engine. The silence that followed was the kind that only exists in places far enough from town that the ordinary ambient noise of human habitation disappears entirely. Wind in the dry grass, the distant circling of a hawk, its wingtip feathers spread wide against the pale sky. The faint ticking of the shovelhead's engine as it cooled. Nora sat on the bike for a long moment. She could feel the key against her chest where it hung on its chain, a small, warm weight she had carried so long she rarely noticed it anymore. The key was old brass, almost black with age, the teeth still sharp and clean, because it had never been used in anything but this one lock on this one door that she had never opened. She swung her leg off the bike and put down the kickstand. She pulled the key over her head and held it in her palm. She walked to the door. The gravel crunched under her boots with each step, dry and precise. The sun was behind her now, and her shadow stretched long across the ground ahead of her, thin and angular, the shadow of a woman who had gotten here by some route she hadn't planned. She did not feel hope. She understood that she should probably, or that the moment warranted it, but what she felt instead was something closer to exhaustion. The deep structural kind. The kind that doesn't come from not sleeping, but from being knocked down so many times that you stop trying to brace for the next impact and simply go down when it comes and lie there until you can get up again. Whatever was inside this garage, she told herself it would not undo what had been done. It would not bring back the house. It would not locate Wren or bring Rick Harlan to account, or restore the 30 years of work that had been reduced to a number on a bank's collections ledger. It would be something her grandmother had thought worth preserving. Something old, probably. Something that meant more to Rosalind than it would to anyone else. That was what she believed when she slid the key into the lock. She was wrong about that. The key turned smooth. The lock mechanism, old as it was, clicked open with a precision that suggested quality construction from an era when quality meant something. The hasp dropped free with a metallic clang that rang out across the hillside and faded into the desert silence. Nora stood with her hand on the edge of the door for a moment. The steel was warm from the afternoon sun. She pulled it open. The hinges screamed. Decades of rust and dry metal grinding together, a sound like something dragged awake from a very long sleep. A wall of cool, dry air rolled out of the darkness, heavier and older than the air outside, the air of a sealed space that had not been disturbed in 26 years. Nora stepped inside and waited while her eyes adjusted. Shapes emerged from the darkness. Tall shapes along the walls. Flat shapes on shelves. A long, low shape in the center of the room under a heavy canvas cover. She found the breaker box near the door by feel and threw the main switch. Fluorescent tubes flickered to life overhead one by one, humming and stuttering before they caught and filled the space with cold white light that pushed the shadows back into the corners. Nora stopped breathing. The walls of the garage were lined with trophies. Not 3 or 4. Not a modest collection accumulated over a hobbyist's weekend races. Dozens of them. Some standing nearly 4 feet tall, brass and silver and dark bronze, set on wooden shelves that looked like they'd been hand-built decades ago with the same careful attention to function over appearance that characterized everything else in the room. The labels on them had yellowed and curled at the edges, but the lettering was still readable. First place, Daytona Beach Sand Races, 1937. Women's Division Champion, Women's Champion, Wisconsin TT Course, 1938. First place, Pikes Peak Hill Climb Classic, 1940. Nora walked along the wall slowly. She read each label, each date, each event. Her boots echoed in the silence. Every trophy had a small engraved plate at its base, and the name on every single one was identical. Rosalind Callahan. Rosalind Callahan. Rosalind Callahan. Her grandmother had been a motorcycle racer. Not a hobbyist, not a weekend enthusiast, a champion. A national champion in an era when women were not supposed to be near a motorcycle at all. When the idea of a woman competing in a timed race on dirt and asphalt against the kinds of machines that killed men regularly was something that didn't fit inside the available categories of what women did. Nora had spent 30 years in the motorcycle trade. She had met racers and builders and collectors from across the country. She had attended Daytona Sturgis Pikes Peak, the vintage circuits, the small local events, and the massive national gatherings. She had never in all those years heard the name Rosalind Callahan spoken by anyone. She turned in a slow circle. The back wall was covered entirely with photographs. Black and white, some of them, and some sepia brown with age, framed in simple dark wood, and hung edge to edge in rows that went nearly to the ceiling. A young woman in leather riding gear and large round goggles standing beside a long, low motorcycle. The same young woman crouched low over handlebars at full lean on a dirt oval, her rear wheel throwing a rooster tail of loose earth. The same woman standing on a wooden podium accepting a trophy from a man in a suit, while a crowd pressed in on all sides, several faces in the crowd wearing expressions that fell somewhere between admiration and disbelief. The woman in every photograph was her grandmother. 20 years old, maybe, 25, 30 at the oldest, young and strong and completely, utterly alive in a way that Nora had never seen in any of the photographs she'd grown up with. The careful studio portraits and holiday snapshots of a woman who seemed always to be holding something in reserve, keeping something back. Nora walked to the center of the room. The canvas cover was over something large. She already knew what it was before she touched it. She could see the outline, the curve of a fuel tank. the spoke of a wire wheel. She grabbed the edge of the canvas and pulled it back in one motion. The motorcycle underneath was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was an Indian. Not a reproduction, not a restoration, not the kind of thing built to look like the original from a comfortable distance. An original Indian 4 1936, in a condition that should not have been possible given its age. The paint was a deep cherry red that had not faded because no light had reached it in decades. The chrome was flawless, unblemished by rust or oxidation, preserved by the same sealed dry air that had kept the rest of the garage in suspension. The leather saddle was cracked in a few places along the seams, but still intact, still shaped to the body of the rider who had sat on it last, shaped to a specific weight and posture that Nora would never know. On the fuel tank, painted by hand in gold pinstriping, with a steadiness that suggested years of practice, a white circle and inside it a number. 7. A small brass plate was riveted to the frame near the engine. Nora crouched down and read it. Indian Motorcycle Company, Springfield, Massachusetts, 1936. She stayed there for a moment with her hands on her knees, not touching the bike, just looking at it. She knew exactly what a 1936 Indian 4 was worth in the current market. Every serious person in the old iron world knew. They came up for auction perhaps once a decade, and when they did, the numbers were staggering. The last one she'd read about had sold at a documented auction for just under $500,000, and it had been in considerably worse condition than this one. She stood and walked to the workbench along the far wall. The bench was covered with tools and small components arranged in careful order, carburetor jets, lined up by size, a row of wrenches hanging on pegboard above. On the bench beside an old oil can sat a plain wooden box, unfinished. No varnish, no hardware, about the size of a shoebox. Nora lifted the lid. Inside, a journal bound in black leather, its cover worn smooth with handling. A stack of letters tied with brown twine, the paper darkened with age. A racing patch faded nearly to illegibility, the embroidered outline of a number just visible at its center. A gold pocket watch with a scratched crystal, and an envelope sealed with her name written on the front in her grandmother's handwriting. Nora. Just that, nothing else. She sat down on the workbench stool. Dust rose around her. She could hear her own heartbeat in the stillness. She opened the envelope. The letter inside was written on 2 pages of cream stationery, dated August 1998, 1 year before Rosalind died. The handwriting was steady and precise. Whatever Rosalind had been at 90 years old, she had not been diminished. Nora. If you are reading this, you are out of choices. I am sorry for that. I knew this day might come for you. The Callahan women have always been hard on themselves and easy on the people who hurt them. I was no different. Your mother was no different. I hope your daughter has found a way to be different, but I think she may not have. Number 7 was my best ride. I won 11 races on her and carried things across this country on her that I was never permitted to speak of. She is yours now, along with everything else in this building. Use her well. There are letters in this box from men who tried to take her from me. One of them was a banker named Thaddeus Alford. He came here in 1962 and again in 1971, both times with documents that were not what he claimed. His son Preston is still alive. He knows the stories. He will come when he learns that you exist and that you have found this place. Be ready, all my love. Rosalind. Nora read it twice. Then she sat very still and looked at the words on the page without seeing them. She looked at the trophies on the walls. She looked at the Indian gleaming under the fluorescent lights with its number 7 gold and perfect on the tank. She looked at the date on the letter again. Then she reached into the box and picked up the gold pocket watch. It was warm in her palm, inexplicably warm, as though it had been sitting in sunlight rather than sealed in darkness for a quarter century. She wound it 3 careful turns. The mechanism inside clicked and caught. The second hand began to move. She stood. She walked to the open door and stood in the rectangle of afternoon light, looking out at the hills, at the dirt track, at the shovel head parked in the dry grass with its engine ticked down to silence. She stood there for a long time without moving. She did not cry. She said it out loud to nobody, to the desert, to the woman whose photographs covered the wall behind her. Okay, I hear you. She turned back into the garage. There was a workbench that hadn't been touched in 26 years. Tools on pegboard older than she was. History she hadn't known existed until 30 minutes ago. She picked up a rag from the bench and started wiping down the surface. Dust came away in thick gray streaks, revealing wood underneath that was scarred and stained and absolutely solid. That was when she heard the engines. Two of them, coming up the dirt track fast, not the sound of someone unsure of the road. The sound of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Nora walked to the doorway and looked out. Two pickup trucks. Black, both of them lifted high on oversized tires. The kind of trucks that existed primarily to communicate something about the person driving them. They came up the road without slowing and pulled into the clearing in front of the garage with the casual confidence of people who had already decided the outcome of whatever came next. They parked at an angle, not quite blocking the track out, but close enough. Four men stepped out. Three of them she had never seen. Large men in work jeans and heavy boots, the kind whose actual function was to stand at a certain distance and make a space feel smaller. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. The fourth man she recognized. She'd seen his face on a billboard along the county highway and on the side of a bus and on the back page of a real estate circular that had shown up in her mailbox 2 springs ago. Younger than her by 20 years. Broad shoulders and an expensive haircut, and the particular tan that comes from outdoor events rather than outdoor labor. A suit jacket worn over an open-collar shirt, the studied casualness of a man who wanted to seem approachable but hadn't quite figured out how. Preston Alford, Alford Development Group, Prescott's most active commercial land developer according to the circular. He walked toward her with his hand already extended the way men like him had learned to approach situations they expected to control. Mrs. Callahan, I'm Preston Alford, Alford Development. I believe we may have had some communication last spring. Nora didn't move, didn't take his hand. You left a message. I didn't call back. Alford lowered his hand without visible embarrassment. He looked around the property with the assessing gaze of a man calculating square footage and access road potential. I'll be direct with you, he said. My understanding is the county may be moving to condemn this parcel. Environmental concerns, potential soil contamination from prior industrial use. I'd hate to see you lose the land for nothing when I'm in a position to offer you something real today. He paused, waiting for her to fill the silence. She didn't. I'm prepared to offer $40,000. Cash transaction close within the week. You walk away clean, avoid any cleanup liability the county might pursue. Nora looked at him, then past him at the 3 men standing by the trucks, then back at Alford. You know what's inside the garage? Alford blinked. His expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted slightly, a recalibration. I'm sorry. You know what's inside the garage. You wouldn't be here otherwise. Your father knew. He came here in 1962 with an offer my grandmother refused. He came back in 1971 with 2 men and a document claiming a lien on the property. The document was a forgery. She turned him down then too. Nora took 1 step toward him. She wrote all of it down. Dates, names, the specific language he used. Witnesses to both visits. My grandmother was a very thorough woman. Alford's face had gone still in the way that faces go still when the conversation has moved somewhere the person wasn't prepared for. The easy professional warmth was still technically present, but it had stopped reaching his eyes. Mrs. Callahan, I want to be clear that this is not a hostile situation. I'm offering you a fair market value for a parcel that frankly presents some regulatory complications. Get off my property. The largest of the 3 men by the trucks took a step forward. He was broad across the chest with a scar that cut through one eyebrow, and he moved with the deliberate economy of someone who did this kind of thing regularly. He didn't speak. He simply moved, and the movement was itself a kind of speech. Nora looked at him directly, held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she looked back at Alford. "Mr. Alford, I have been thrown from a motorcycle at highway speed. I have been hit with a chain by a man who outweighed me by 100 pounds. I have been shot at on 2 separate occasions. I have buried a husband and watched my daughter disappear and spent 2 years losing everything I built over 30 years of honest work. You brought 3 men to intimidate a 75-year-old woman standing in front of a garage in the middle of the Arizona desert." She pulled a phone from the inside pocket of her jacket, old, a model that predated touchscreens with actual physical buttons worn smooth with use. "You have 60 seconds to be back in those trucks. After that, I make a call. The people who answer this phone are not wearing suits. They are not interested in property values or regulatory frameworks. And they have been waiting a very long time for me to ask them for something." Alford stared at her. Nobody moved. The wind pushed a thin skiff of dust across the clearing. Somewhere in the hills above the garage, a hawk called once sharp and clear. Then Alford straightened his jacket. He looked at Nora with an expression she had seen before on other faces, at other moments the look of a man absorbing a setback and already calculating his next approach. "We'll give you some time to consider your options," he said. He nodded at his men. They got back in the trucks without speaking. Alford walked to his own door, opened it, and paused. "The county filing is a matter of public record, Mrs. Callahan. That's not going to change regardless of how many friends you call." He got in. The truck started. They reversed down the dirt track, and a rooster tail of dust in their taillights disappeared around the first bend. Nora stood in the clearing with the phone in her hand. She didn't put it away. She stood there for a moment looking at the empty track, at the settling dust. Then she dialed a number she hadn't called in 11 years. It rang twice. A man's voice answered, deep and rough with the quality of gravel sliding on a slope. "Beckett. You still among the living?" She hadn't been called that in years. Her road name. Not her given name, just the surname on its own, the way the club had always used it. Hearing it now felt like a door opening somewhere in her chest. "Still here, Hawk. What do you need?" 10 bikes at my grandmother's property outside Prescott. Tomorrow morning before sunrise." A short silence. "What kind of situation suits? And one of them has been here before." Another silence. Longer this time. "Lock the door, Beckett. We'll be there before it gets light." He hung up. Nora put the phone away. She looked at the dust still settling on the track. She turned and walked back into the garage, pulled the heavy steel door closed behind her, and shot the interior bolts. She went to the workbench. She sat on the stool. She opened the black leather journal. The first entry was dated March 1934. The handwriting was the same she had known her whole life, only younger, a little less controlled, still finding its precision. The ink had faded to brown. Paid $200 for the bike. Rode her home in the rain. "Every man at Gunderson's thought I wouldn't make it out of the lot. I made it. Didn't tell any of them that." Nora read the next entry and the one after that. Outside, the desert settled into its evening silence. The light through the cracks around the door changed from gold to orange to the deep violet of a desert dusk. The hawk stopped circling. The temperature dropped the way it always does in Arizona, fast and complete, as though the heat of the day had been a loan that came due the moment the sun crossed the ridge. Inside the garage, Nora read. She read about the first race Rosalind had entered in 1935 at a county fairground circuit in central Wisconsin, registered under the name R. Callahan, because the promoter's entry form didn't specify otherwise, and she kept her helmet and goggles on until after the checkered flag. She read about the first time a track official tried to disqualify her after the race, about the argument that followed about the other riders who stood around watching without intervening, about Rosalind walking away with the trophy regardless. She read about crashes, about a collarbone broken at 40 miles an hour on a dirt oval in Indiana, and riding the final 6 laps of that race anyway, because she was already leading. About a front-wheel washout on wet asphalt in Ohio that put her in a ditch and cost her 3 days, 2 of them unconscious. About getting up from all of it. She read about the men who tried to stop her, who filed complaints with race organizers, who told her in language that ranged from polite to threatening that she was competing in something that wasn't hers to compete in. She read about how Rosalind had handled each of these men with a patience and consistency that looked from the outside like indifference, but was in fact something more deliberate. I write down what they say and who they are, and when they say it, Rosalind had written in the summer of 1939. Not because I expect to use it, because I have learned that the world tells women their experiences did not happen. I intend to make that difficult. The trophies around Nora were the documented evidence of a life the world had tried to tell Rosalind she wasn't living. It was past midnight when she felt her boot touch something on the floor near the base of the bench. She looked down. A small brass ring set flush into the wood of the floor, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. She pushed her stool back and crouched down. She hooked her finger through the ring and pulled. A section of the floor lifted on a hidden hinge, a trap door roughly 2 feet square, set into the concrete so precisely that its seams were barely visible. The air that came up from the darkness below was even drier than the garage above, and cool in the way that underground spaces stay cool in the desert, regardless of what the surface temperature does. Nora looked down into the darkness. Then she went to the workbench and found a flashlight, old heavy, the kind with a rubber grip, and clicked it on. She aimed the beam down into the space below. What she saw there made her sit down slowly on the edge of the trap door and stay there for a very long time, looking while the Indian fort gleamed behind her in the fluorescent light, and the desert lay silent and immeasurable in all directions around the small concrete garage on the hill. The beam of the flashlight moved slowly across the space below. Cedar planks lined the walls and floor, fitted tightly together with the kind of joinery that takes time and care, and a person who understands that preservation is a form of intention. The air down there was clean and still untouched by the decades of Arizona sun that had bleached and cracked everything above ground. A small wooden ladder led down from the trapdoor, its rungs worn smooth in the middle, from hands that had used it regularly once, and then not at all for a very long time. Nora climbed down. The space at the bottom was the size of a large closet, maybe 8 feet by 10, with a ceiling low enough that she had to drop her chin slightly to stand fully upright. The walls were lined with shelves built from the same cedar as the floor, and the shelves were full. Every item was wrapped in heavy oilcloth tied with waxed cord and labeled in her grandmother's handwriting on small cards tucked under the cord. The cards had yellowed, but the ink was still legible. She moved the flashlight to the nearest shelf and read the card on the first wrapped bundle. Crocker V Twin Frame, 1939. Acquired 1953. Gunderson Estate Sale, Milwaukee. Paid $75. Nora put her free hand against the oilcloth. She could feel the geometry of metal through the fabric. She knew without unwrapping it what a Crocker frame felt like. She had handled one once at a private collection showing in Scottsdale, handled it with the particular reverence that the object demanded because fewer than 100 Crockers had ever been built before the company folded in 1942. Because the machines had been handmade to individual rider specification by a man named Albert Crocker, who believed that a motorcycle should fit the person who rode it rather than the other way around. And because what that meant in practical terms was that every remaining example was unique and irreplaceable. She moved the light to the next shelf. Bro Superior SS 100. Fuel tank and front forks. 1929. Acquired 1961. Private sale Albuquerque. Seller claimed provenance from Lawrence Estate. I believe him. The flashlight beam held steady on that card for a long moment. T.E. Lawrence. Lawrence of Arabia. The man who had owned and ridden a series of Brow Superiors throughout his life with a passion that bordered on devotion, who had died in 1935 when his front wheel caught a dip in a road in Dorset and threw him over the handlebars at speed. Other pieces of his collection had scattered in the years after his death passed through private hands, lost to time and disorganization in the way that objects lose their context when the person who gave them meaning is gone. Rosalind had believed the seller, and Rosalind Nora was beginning to understand had not been a woman who believed things carelessly. She went through the rest of the shelves, methodically reading each card, lifting each oilcloth just enough to confirm what the card described. A Vincent Black Lightning engine, complete 1952, all original components. Acquired 1978. Paid $500. Nobody wants these anymore. Rosalind had written on the card in a hand slightly more cramped than her earlier writing, the hand of a woman in her 70s. They will. An Excelsior Super X tank, 1929. A Henderson four-cylinder head, 1930. 3 sets of period racing wheels, their spokes still tight and true, wrapped individually and stacked in a corner with the precision of a person who understood that how you store something determines whether it survives. At the bottom of the shelving on the back wall, tucked into the corner where the cedar planks met, was a small ledger bound in cloth, its cover soft with handling. Nora picked it up and opened it. Every piece in the room was documented. Date acquired, price paid, source, notes on provenance and condition, cross-references to supporting documentation that Rosalind had kept in a separate file. At the bottom of the last page in pencil, rather than ink, dated simply 1998. Whatever it is worth, it belongs to her now. Use it well. Don't let them tell you what it means. Nora stood in the cedar cellar for a long time without moving. She thought about her grandmother driving out to Milwaukee in 1953 to attend an estate sale, paying $75 for a motorcycle frame that nobody else in the room understood, loading it into whatever she'd been driving, and bringing it back here to this hill and wrapping it in oilcloth and lowering it into a room she'd built specifically to keep it. She thought about Rosalind doing that again in 1961, again in 1978, year after year, piece by piece, with the patience of someone playing a very long game that no one else knew she was playing. She thought about all the conversations she'd never had with her grandmother, the silences she'd attributed to reserve or age, or the particular distance that sometimes grows between generations when the years between them contain things that don't translate easily into words. She thought about sitting across from Rosalind at her kitchen table in 1985, in 1991, in 1996, having ordinary conversations about ordinary things, while this garage sat on this hill holding everything her grandmother had never once mentioned. Then she climbed back up the ladder and closed the trapdoor. She sat on the floor of the garage with her back against the workbench and the black journal in her lap and kept reading. The entries after 1942 were different. The racing prose dropped away entirely, the vivid present tense quality of those earlier entries. What replaced them was something more guarded, more deliberate. The handwriting was the same, but the sentences were shorter, stripped to their necessary minimum, the writing of someone who had learned in a new context that information is a thing that can be taken from you. She had been approached in the spring of 1942, not by the military, by a man named Everett Doss, who worked for the Office of Strategic Services, who found her through a contact at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, who had seen her race in 1939 and remembered the name. Doss had come to her in Prescott and explained what the OSS needed without explaining why, which was standard, and without making any promises, which she respected. He said they needed couriers. People who could move documents and materials across the interior of the country without attracting attention. People who knew routes that weren't on standard maps. People who could be relied upon to arrive and to keep their mouths shut. He said a woman on a motorcycle traveling alone was among the least scrutinized categories of traveler in the American West. He was correct about that. Rosalind had written about her first assignment in a shorthand that stripped all identifying information from the account names, reduced to initials, locations, to compass headings and distances. But the shape of it was clear. She had ridden from Prescott to a location in the high desert of New Mexico, carrying documents in a false bottom compartment built into the Indian's left saddlebag by a mechanic the OSS had sent to her garage. And she had delivered them to a contact and ridden home without incident. She did this for 3 years. Arizona, New Mexico, California, Nevada. Routes that followed dry riverbeds and mining tracks and the remnants of roads built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 30s and then largely forgotten. Passes through mountain ranges that didn't appear on the maps available to the general public. Desert crossings that required knowing where water was and how long you could go without finding it. Nobody stopped her. Nobody questioned her. A woman traveling alone on a motorcycle was occasionally an object of curiosity and occasionally a target for the wrong kind of attention. But she was never in 3 years of this work treated as a potential carrier of classified materials. She was simply a woman on a road, which was apparently something that the security apparatus of wartime America had not built itself to process as a threat. She wrote about this with a dry precision that Nora recognized as the closest her grandmother came to humor. The things I carry are worth more than this machine, Rosalind had written in the summer of 1943. The people who would stop me are looking for men in cars. I have delivered 11 packages in 14 months and been asked for my papers exactly once by a young soldier at a checkpoint outside Albuquerque, who looked at the Indian and asked if I'd built it myself. I told him no, that I'd bought it in Springfield and ridden it to Arizona and that it needed a carburetor adjustment. He waved me through and told me to be careful on the highway. I said I would be. At the back of the journal, tucked between the last page and the rear cover, was a small velvet pouch that Nora had missed when she first went through the box. She opened it. 3 medals, tarnished silver, each one the size of a silver dollar. Each one stamped on the front with an eagle over a shield, and on the back with a date and a series of letters and numbers that meant nothing to her, but clearly meant something to whoever had issued them. They were not the kind of medals that came with ceremonies or citations. They were the kind that were handed over in an office quietly by someone who shook your hand and thanked you and asked you never to speak of it. Rosalind Callahan had been a courier for American intelligence during the Second World War. She had done this work on the Indian Four. She had done it in silence, and she had apparently maintained that silence for the rest of her life through 55 years of ordinary existence in Prescott, Arizona, until she sat down in August of 1998 and wrote a letter to a granddaughter she expected would someday have nothing left and need something to hold on to. Nora held one of the medals in her palm. She started to laugh. A short, sharp sound that bounced off the concrete walls and came back to her changed. She couldn't have explained to anyone why it was funny. It wasn't funny in any conventional sense. It was more that the accumulated weight of what she was holding, what she was looking at, what she was understanding about the woman she had sat across from at kitchen tables for 50 years, without once knowing any of this, needed somewhere to go. And laughter was what was available. She was still sitting on the floor when the first light appeared under the garage door. Not sunrise. The approach of it, that preliminary gray that comes to the desert sky an hour before the sun actually crosses the horizon, thin and sourceless, and gradually distinguishable from the darkness that preceded it. Nora became aware of it and registered that she had been reading for most of the night without noticing the time passing. Then she heard the engines. Not trucks this time, motorcycles. Multiple, their sound carrying through the still pre-dawn air, with the low rolling resonance that old American iron produces, a sound that is less a noise than a physical sensation, something that moves through the body rather than just past it. She heard them coming down from the ridge road, heard them slow and begin the final approach up the dirt track, and she stood and went to the door and drew back the interior bolts and pulled it open. The sky was gray and enormous. The desert lay still and pale in every direction. 11 motorcycles came up the track in a loose formation, headlights cutting through the last of the dark. They came without hurry and without the aggressive throttle work of men trying to impress anyone, just a steady, controlled approach. And they pulled into the clearing and stopped in a rough arc and cut their engines one by one. The silence that followed the last engine shutting down was the particular silence that only exists in the immediate aftermath of motorcycle noise. The silence that seems more complete than other silences because of what it replaced. They swung off their bikes, men and women both, most of them gray now, all of them wearing leather with patches that matched the one on Nora's own jacket. Club patches from 3 decades ago, event patches from runs she hadn't attended, the Iron Maiden's crest, in varying states of fade and wear. They'd been riding this long without her, and the evidence of it was there in the weathering of their gear, and the way they moved and held themselves, people who hadn't stopped even when she had. The man at the front was Rex Pruitt, They called him Hawk and had for 30 years since a night in New Mexico when he'd spotted a police checkpoint from a quarter-mile out in total darkness and gotten 11 riders off the highway before anyone reached it. He was in his late 50s now, gray-bearded and broad across the shoulders, moving with the deliberate economy of a man who had learned long ago that efficiency and effectiveness were the same thing. He stopped in front of her and looked at her face. Really looked the way people look when they're doing inventory rather than just making contact. "You've been up all night." "Yes." He nodded, accepting this as information rather than something requiring comment. He looked past her into the garage. His eyes moved across the trophies on the walls, the photographs, and then settled on the Indian 4 in the center of the room. He was quiet for a long time. The woman who stopped beside him was Deb Voss. They called her Ironside after the incident with the highway guardrail in 1998 that she had walked away from when she should not have. She was large and silver-haired, and she had the stillness of someone who had made peace with most of the things that other people spent their lives fighting. She looked at the trophies, then at the photographs on the back wall. Then she walked slowly into the garage and stood in front of the photos and read the names on the trophies nearest her. Rosalind Callahan Ironside said quietly to herself, "Daytona, 1937. She turned around. "I know that name. From the vintage circuit, from a piece someone wrote in an old magazine about women in early American racing. Three names they kept finding in the records from the 30s and 40s, and then losing again. Rosalind Callahan was one of them. I never knew what happened to her. Never knew she was from Arizona. Never knew any of this existed. She was my grandmother," Nora said, "and I didn't know any of it either. Not until last night." Ironside looked at her for a moment. Then she looked back at the photographs. "Someone is trying to take this place." Nora said it to all of them, not just Ironside, not just Hawk. All of them. They were all listening already. "That's why I called." Hawk said, "Then they're not going to take it." He walked back outside and pulled out his phone. By 8 in the morning, there were 30 bikes in the clearing. Those people had called the specific network that exists within the old iron community. The one built from decades of runs and repairs, and the particular loyalty that forms between people who have shared road and weather and breakdown, and the understanding that the machine between your legs is both the point and beside the point simultaneously. They came from Prescott and Flagstaff and Jerome and Sedona. Some of them faces Nora recognized, and some of them strangers, all of them understanding, without needing to be told in detail, what kind of situation this was. By 9, the first news van appeared at the bottom of the dirt track. Nora didn't know who had made that call. She suspected Ironside, who had a way of understanding what a situation required that went beyond what she ever directly stated. The van came up slowly, uncertain of the road, and a woman with a camera got out and looked at the motorcycles and at the garage and at the sign Nora had written on a piece of cardboard and propped against the outside wall that morning. "Private property, no trespassing. Rosalind Callahan Workshop, established 1946. Dr. Warren Stiles arrived at 10:15 in a gray sedan that looked like it belonged to someone who had never once in his life considered what kind of car he drove. He was a small man in his mid-60s, compact and precise, giving the impression of having organized his entire physical existence around efficiency of motion. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm and a magnifying loupe in his jacket pocket, and he had the expression of a man who had spent his whole professional life being very careful not to get excited until the evidence warranted it, and was currently working very hard at maintaining that discipline. Ironside had called him. She'd known him from her years on the vintage circuit, from shows and auctions, and the small overlap between the riding world and the collecting world where people like Stiles and people like Ironside occasionally occupied the same room. She'd told him what was here. He had driven from Phoenix that morning without, as far as Nora could tell, stopping for breakfast. Nora took him into the garage. He stood in front of the Indian 4 for a full 3 minutes without speaking. His hands were clasped behind his back. He didn't move except to lean slightly forward once, then straighten again. The other riders had stayed outside by unspoken agreement, giving the man room to work. Then he crouched down and examined the brass plate on the frame. He took out the loop and examined the engine number stamped into the metal, tracing the individual digits with the tip of one finger without quite touching them. He stood and examined the paint on the fuel tank, the gold pinstriping, the white circle, and the number 7 inside it. He looked at the trophies on the walls and then at the photographs. He turned around. Mrs. Callahan. His voice was careful and measured. This is the motorcycle Rosalind Callahan rode at Daytona Beach in 1937. The frame number matches documentation in our pre-war racing records. The paint and pinstriping match the photographs taken at the event. This is, to the best of my current assessment, the most significant surviving pre-war American racing motorcycle to come to light in at least 40 years. He gestured at the walls, at the photographs, at the trophies with their yellowed labels. The Smithsonian would like to discuss an acquisition, Mrs. Callahan. We would also be prepared to explore a loan arrangement that would keep the motorcycle in your ownership while permitting it to be displayed in our transportation collection. Nora looked at him. How much? He named a number. It was more money than she had ever heard directed at her personally in her life. More than 30 years of running Callahan Cycle Works had netted her in total. More than the house had been worth before it was taken. More than she had imagined the garage contained, even after she'd spent the night reading the journal and understanding what the pieces in the cellar were worth. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. I'll think about it, she said. She walked past him and out of the garage, past the riders gathered in the clearing, past the news camera that swung toward her, and then away again when she didn't slow down or acknowledge it. She walked to where Preston Alford's black SUV had appeared at the edge of the clearing, halfway up the track, stopped there with the engine running. He had come back. He hadn't come with his 3 men this time, just himself and a man beside him in the passenger seat carrying a leather folder. He stepped out and walked toward her with the measured pace of someone who had regrouped and was trying a different approach. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. An emergency injunction application, he said, signed this morning by a county judge. Environmental remediation order. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises while the county conducts an assessment. After that, the property is under administrative hold. He held it out. Nora didn't take it. She looked at the document in his hand. She looked at his face. Then she looked back at the 30 motorcycles parked in the clearing and the news camera positioned near the road and Dr. Stiles standing in the doorway of the garage with his leather portfolio. My grandmother documented your father's visits here. She said it without raising her voice. The specific language Thaddeus Alford used in 1962. The names of the men he brought in 1971. The description of the forged lien document, the notary stamped the date discrepancy that the county sheriff identified at the time. She kept that file in this building for 52 years. She looked at the injunction in his hand. The moment you file that paper, everything in that file goes to the state attorney's office. Every news outlet in Arizona gets a copy the same afternoon. Dr. Stiles from the Smithsonian will be available to explain to anyone who asks exactly what this motorcycle is worth and who it belongs to. And the 30 riders behind me have been talking to journalists since 9 this morning. She watched him calculate. She had watched enough men make this calculation to know what it looked like from the outside. The document went back into his jacket. Alford looked at her for a long moment. What was left on his face was something flat and contained the expression of a man filing information away for future consideration. This conversation isn't over, he said. Yes, it is, Nora said. He got back in the SUV. The injunction document stayed in his pocket. The SUV backed slowly down the track and turned at the bend and disappeared. He did not come back. The sheriff arrived 20 minutes later in a county cruiser. His name was Tate Briggs, a man in his early 50s with the measured demeanor of someone who had learned over a long career that most situations are more complicated than they initially appear and that patience is cheaper than mistakes. He walked up to her with his hat in his hand. Mrs. Callahan, I understand Mr. Alford filed a complaint this morning about access to this property. He doesn't have access to this property. She said it simply. He came here yesterday and again this morning without invitation. Briggs nodded. He also made some claims about a county environmental action on this parcel. Nora looked at him. I checked with the clerk's office at 6 this morning, Briggs said. There is no pending environmental action on this parcel. There is no filed condemnation proceeding. There is no record of any county communication with the owner of this property regarding environmental concerns of any kind. He said it with the careful neutrality of a man reporting facts and declining to editorialize on their implications. I thought you'd want to know that, he said. Nora said, I appreciate it. Briggs looked at the bikes, at the garage, at Dr. Stiles, who had come to stand in the doorway with his leather portfolio and his expression of careful professional composure. Quite a place you have here, Mrs. Callahan. It belonged to my grandmother. He put his hat back on, nodded once, walked back to his cruiser, and drove away. The news van left an hour after that. Dr. Stiles shook her hand before he left and told her his offer stood regardless of when or whether she decided to act on it, and that the Smithsonian was not in the habit of withdrawing offers for objects of this significance. He gave her a card with 3 different contact numbers on it and said to call any of them at any hour. Most of the riders cleared out by mid-afternoon. They had jobs to return to families, the ordinary obligations of people whose lives continued beyond the specific moments when they were needed. But they had been there when it mattered, and in Nora's understanding of how things worked, that was the only measure that counted. Hawk stayed. So did Ironside. So did a handful of others with no particular place to be that afternoon. They sat outside the garage in the low afternoon sun on whatever they could find to sit on toolboxes and turned over buckets and the running boards of the few trucks that had come. Someone produced a thermos of coffee. Someone else had sandwiches from a gas station in Prescott, the kind that come in plastic triangles and taste exactly like what they are, but nobody complained. Nora sat among them and felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years. Not safety exactly, not relief. Something more structural than either of those things. The feeling of not being alone in a situation of having people around her whose presence was unconditional in the specific way that only comes from shared history rather than shared interest. These were not people who were here because of what the garage contained or what it might be worth. They were here because she had called and they had come, which was the oldest and simplest version of loyalty and the only one that held up under examination. She told them about the journal, about the OSS work, about the medals. Ironside listened without interrupting. When Nora finished, Ironside was quiet for a moment, looking at the garage door. She rode that motorcycle across the desert carrying classified documents during a world war, Ironside said. And nobody knew. Nobody knew, Nora said. Another silence. My grandmother on my father's side drove a truck for a munitions plant in Detroit during the war, Ironside said. She never talked about it either. Not once. We found out after she died from a photograph someone had taken at the plant. Hawk said women of that generation didn't talk about what they did. They just did it. Nora didn't say anything. She was thinking about Rosalind at the kitchen table. Rosalind at Christmas, at birthdays, at the small ordinary occasions of a family's shared time. Thinking about all the ways a person can be present in a room and still be elsewhere, entirely holding something back that has no place in the available conversation. Later, after Ironside left and Hawk had gone to check on his bike, Nora went back into the garage alone. She stood in front of the Indian 4. She had sold a portion of the collection from the cellar to Dr. Stiles. Not everything, just the pieces he'd identified as strong candidates for the Smithsonian's transportation collection, the Crocker frame, the Brow Superior components, the Vincent engine. The number he had paid for those pieces, combined with what she'd already received in advance after a brief negotiation, was enough. Enough to clear the debt that Rick Harlan had created in her name. Enough to pay the lawyers who had fought the foreclosure and lost. Enough to satisfy the collection agencies and the credit card companies and the various institutional entities that had been calling her number for 2 years. And enough left over for a down payment on something small. She had signed the paperwork that afternoon at the tailgate of Hawk's truck with Hawk and Ironside as witnesses, and a notary Ironside had called from Prescott. The pieces would be collected the following week by a professional handling company with climate-controlled transport and full insurance documentation. She had kept the Indian 4. She had kept the trophies, the photographs, the journal, the medals, the pocket watch still running, still keeping time. She had kept the garage. And 2 weeks later, standing in front of the building on a Tuesday morning in October with a paintbrush and a ladder and a can of black enamel paint, she had made a new sign for the door. Rosalind Callahan Workshop, established 1946. The old surface had been nothing just weathered concrete with no marking. The new sign was simple, clean, 8 inches high and 4 feet wide, the letters even and permanent. She hung it on iron brackets above the rolled door and stepped back and looked at it. It was the right name for the place. It had always been the right name. She was only catching up to what the building had always been. The boy had shown up 3 days after she'd hung the sign. His name was Cody Webb. He was 15 years old, skinny and quiet, with a stillness that belongs to kids who have learned early that being unnoticed is a form of protection. His mother, Marla, had read about Nora in a brief piece that ran in the Prescott Courier, a paragraph about the Iron Maidens gathering at the property, and the Smithsonian connection, and she had driven Cody out to the garage on a Saturday morning because she said he loved motorcycles and she didn't know what to do with that, and she'd heard Nora used to run a shop. Nora had looked at the boy. He was staring at the Indian 4 with an expression she recognized completely. She had worn that expression herself at 17 in a garage in Phoenix when someone let her stand next to a running flathead for the first time. The expression of someone encountering the thing that makes sense of them. "You know anything about bikes?" she'd asked him. He shook his head. "You want to?" He nodded. "Come back Monday, 7 in the morning. Wear clothes you don't mind ruining." He'd been there at 6:50. She put him to work immediately, not explaining the Indian 4, not letting him near it, starting him where everyone should start, with the most basic mechanical reality of what these machines were. How to clean a carburetor properly, not just surface clean, but disassemble and inspect and understand what each component did and why its condition mattered. How to gap a spark plug. How to listen to an engine at idle and hear what it was telling you. The difference between a clean 4-stroke sound and the variations that indicated problems in compression or timing or fuel delivery. He didn't say much during those first days. He watched and listened and did what she showed him and then did it again until he had it. On the third day, she asked him why he didn't ask questions when he was unsure, and he said he didn't want to bother her. "That's not how this works," she told him. "Not knowing and not asking costs you 3 times as much as not knowing and asking. Ask." After that, he asked constantly, and the questions were good ones. The kind that indicate a person is building a mental model of the system rather than just following a sequence of steps. The others came one at a time over the following weeks. Cass Merritt had driven up from Tucson in a truck with a cutting torch in the bed and a portfolio of welding work on her phone. She was 28 years old, and she could cut a frame in half with a torch and put it back together in better alignment than it had started with. And she knew it, and she stated it without boasting as simple, relevant information. Nora put her to work the same day. Petra Rourke had left an engineering program at Arizona State with a semester to go, a decision she declined to explain in any detail, but that seemed to have involved a fundamental disagreement about what engineering was for. She was better with numbers and tolerances and the technical side of mechanical diagnosis than anyone Nora had worked with at any point in 30 years, and she was 23 years old and still learning. Lou Tanner had spent 6 years as a mechanic maintaining vehicles in conditions where failure was not an option and resources were whatever you could find within 50 feet of the broken thing. She didn't talk about the specifics of where she'd done this work. She didn't need to. Her hands told the story, and the way she approached a problem told it more clearly still. The absolute calm of someone who had diagnosed and repaired things under circumstances that made a broken motorcycle in a clean Arizona garage seem straightforward by comparison. Together, they turned the Rosalind Callahan Workshop into something that functioned. They took in old iron, Harleys and Indians from before 1960, the machines that had defined American motorcycling in the years when American motorcycling was still figuring out what it was. They tore them down to the frame and rebuilt them with the discipline that Nora had spent 30 years developing, the discipline that came from understanding that these machines were irreplaceable and that every decision about how to restore them was a decision about what would survive. Some they completed for customers who had brought them in. Some they donated to museums with the documentation capacity to display them properly. A few they kept for reasons that didn't reduce to the purely mechanical. The Indian 4 stayed in the center of the room on its low wooden platform. Nora had built the platform herself from materials she found behind the garage. She had made a small placard and set it at the base of the front wheel. Indian 4, 1936. Daytona Beach Sand Races, 1937. Women's Division Champion. Number 7. Rider Rosalind Callahan. This motorcycle is not for sale. Every day she walked past it. Every day she touched the fuel tank for just a moment and then took her hand away and went back to whatever she was working on. She had not ridden it. She told herself it was because the machine was too valuable and too significant to risk on the road without a full mechanical inspection she hadn't yet had time to complete properly. She told herself it was because the tires needed to be replaced and the fuel system needed to be flushed and the ignition timing checked before anyone should put it in motion. These things were true. They were also not the reason. The real reason was something she didn't examine too closely. It had to do with the photographs on the wall, with the trophies, with the journal entries about Daytona 1937 and Pikes Peak 1940, and 3 years of classified courier work across the desert Southwest. It had to do with the specific feeling of standing next to something that had been ridden by a woman of that quality and wondering whether you were equal to it, whether you deserved to put your hands on it. Hawk had been watching her for 3 weeks when he finally said something. He had been coming out to the garage on weekends sometimes just to sit on a stool and drink coffee and watch them work, which was a way of being present and available that she recognized as his particular form of loyalty. On a Saturday morning in November, he came in and poured himself coffee and stood in front of the Indian 4 and looked at it for a while. Then he looked at Nora, who was on her back under a 1952 Hydroglide doing an oil change. He said, "You gonna ride that thing or just walk past it for the rest of your life?" Nora slid out from under the glide. "I'll ride it when I'm ready." Hawk looked at her with the expression he got, sometimes the one that meant he was about to say something she didn't want to hear and had decided to say it anyway. "You've been ready your whole life. You're just scared." Nora wiped her hands on a rag. "I'm not scared." "Yeah," he said, "you are. And that's fine. But your grandmother didn't build that room under the floor and fill it with 50 years of history and sit on this hill for half a century, keeping that bike preserved so you could hang a sign over it and walk past it every morning. She wrote it down herself. The bike belongs on the road." Nora didn't answer. Hawk finished his coffee and set the cup on the workbench. "I'll be here tomorrow at sunrise. If you want to ride, we'll ride. If you're not ready, that's fine too. But stop telling yourself the reason is mechanical." He walked out. Cody looked up from the transmission he'd been rebuilding at the other end of the bench. He was careful not to catch her eye, which she appreciated. After a moment, he went back to the transmission. Nora stood in the center of the garage with the rag in her hands. She looked at the Indian 4, at the number 7 on the tank, at the photograph on the wall directly behind it. Her grandmother at Daytona in 1937 crouched over the handlebars at full lean, with the rear wheel throwing sand and the crowd behind her and her whole face invisible behind the helmet and goggles, except for the set of her jaw, which was the jaw of a woman who had already made every decision she needed to make and was simply executing it now. Nora stood there for a long time. Then she went back to the Hydroglide and finished the oil change. That evening, she sat on the small porch of the house she'd bought at the bottom of the hill, the one bedroom with the yard of dirt and sagebrush, and the view up the slope to the garage where the lights were still on, because Cody stayed late most evenings. She sat with the journal in her lap. She opened it to the last page, read the last entry again, the one dated July 1998. "I am 90 years old. I don't have much time left. There are things I should have said to people while I had the chance. I am not going to say them now because that is not my nature, and because some things can only be communicated through what you leave behind. Number 7 belongs on the road, not behind glass, not on a platform, on the road. I hope she remembers that. Nora closed the journal. She sat in the dark for a while listening to the desert. Then she went inside and set her alarm for 5 o'clock in the morning. She woke before the alarm. The sky outside the bedroom window was still fully dark. The darkness that has no gradation to it, no suggestion of what's coming. The darkness that is simply itself without apology. Nora lay on her back for a moment, with her eyes open, and listened to the desert. Wind in the sagebrush. Somewhere far out, the sound of a vehicle on the county road moving away. Nothing else. She got up without going back to sleep because she understood that sleep was no longer available to her. She made coffee in the kitchen and drank it standing at the window, looking up the hill at the garage. The lights were off. She had locked up herself the night before going through the building one last time, before coming down the hill, checking the Indian 4, the way she always checked it visually, and by feel the fuel tank, the frame, the wheels, the engine, looking for anything that had changed or shifted or loosened since the last time she'd looked. Nothing had changed. Nothing ever changed. The bike sat on its platform in the same precise condition it had occupied for the past several weeks, perfect and patient. She finished the coffee and rinsed the cup and went to the bedroom and dressed in the dark. Jeans, boots, the thermal underlayer she wore in the mornings, now that November had come, and the desert cold had settled into the pre-dawn hours with its particular clean severity. She put on the leather jacket last. The Iron Maiden's patches caught the dim light from the hallway. She walked up the hill. The gravel of the track crunched under her boots in the silence. The stars were out in the way they get in the desert far from city light, not scattered but dense, the full reality of them visible in a way that the ambient glow of populated places erases entirely. She could see her breath in the cold air, small clouds that dissolved immediately and left no trace. She unlocked the garage door and pushed it open. The fluorescent lights came on overhead with their usual flicker and hum, the cold white light filling the space from the walls outward, pushing the shadows into the corners. The trophies on the walls caught the light and threw it back dull and warm. The photographs on the back wall were still her grandmother's face, repeated in every frame, young and certain and fully present in every image. The Indian 4 sat in the center of the room. Nora stood inside the doorway for a moment and looked at it. Then she walked to the workbench and pulled on her riding gloves. Old gloves, the leather worn smooth at the palm and stiff along the knuckles, gloves that had been on her hands for more miles than she could accurately calculate. She picked up the helmet from the shelf where she'd set it the night before. A full-face helmet, not new but sound. She walked to the Indian. She stood beside it for a long moment with her gloved hands at her sides. The fuel tank was at eye level from where she stood, the number 7 in its white circle, the gold pinstriping catching the light, the same way it must have caught the light at Daytona in 1937, when Rosalind rolled up to the start line among the other riders, and the crowd pressed in to see, and the men at the line had looked at her and not known what they were looking at yet. Nora put her hand on the seat. The leather was cold and cracked along the seams in the precise pattern of a saddle, shaped by decades of use to the specific contours of a specific rider, the weight and posture of a woman who was not Nora, who had sat here in a different decade under different circumstances with different purposes. She could feel the shape of those absences through her gloved palm, the hollows and compressions that Rosalind had left in the leather over years of riding. She had read the journal entry about the Indian starting procedure many times. Rosalind had written it down with the methodical clarity she brought to everything mechanical, not in the early journals, but in a later entry from the 1950s, as though she'd suddenly decided that this information needed to exist outside her own head. Number 7 responds best to a firm throttle setting at about a third open before the first kick. She likes to be warm before you ask anything of her. Choke close for the first 2 kicks open on the third. If she hasn't caught by the 5th kick, she's telling you something is wrong, and you should listen to her rather than argue. She has never been wrong about this. Nora had read that entry so many times she could have recited it. She wheeled the Indian off the platform. The weight of it surprised her the way it always surprises people who haven't handled a machine of this type in age. Not the dead weight of something broken, but the substantial, purposeful weight of a machine built before the industry had learned to shape mass as a design priority, built instead for endurance and reliability, and the specific demands of roads that in 1936 were not yet fully paved and smooth. It was heavier than her shovelhead, heavier than most things she'd ridden in the last 20 years. She walked it toward the door with both hands on the bars and felt the weight settle through her wrists and forearms and into her shoulders alive, in the way that machines with internal combustion engines are always slightly alive even when they're not running the potential of the thing present in its mass. She walked it out into the clearing. The sky had begun to change. Not light yet, not the first gray, but something different in the darkness above the eastern ridge. A quality of the black that suggested it was the last of the dark rather than the middle of it. The stars directly overhead were still at their full brightness. The air was cold and still and completely silent. She stood beside the bike in the clearing and put on the helmet and clipped the chin strap. She had made the decision alone in the dark without witnesses because some things don't need an audience to be real, and this was one of them. Then she set the throttle closed, the choke put her boot on the kickstart, and pressed down. Nothing. The engine didn't catch, didn't cough, gave no indication it had registered the attempt. She already knew this from the journal. The first kick is the machine becoming aware of you. Second kick. A sound this time deep in the engine, a compression thump that was not ignition but was the system waking up, acknowledging the input. The choke still closed. Third kick. Open the choke. She opened it, repositioned her boot, pressed down with her full weight behind it. The engine caught. The sound that came out of it was not like the sound of her shovelhead, not like any modern motorcycle she'd ridden, not like anything she could directly compare to something else. It was deeper and more irregular at idle. A four-cylinder sound from an era before four-cylinder smoothness was something engineers optimized for, a sound that had texture and variation in it, that pulsed rather than hummed, that communicated the specific mechanical events occurring inside the engine in a way that later machines learned to suppress, and this one never had. It was the most honest engine sound she had ever heard. She stood beside the running bike for a full minute with her hand on the throttle and felt the vibration move up through the bars and into her palms and forearms. The engine settled into its idle, rougher than a modern machine would tolerate, a rolling rhythm that was irregular enough to seem alive. Nora swung her leg over the seat and settled her weight into it. The suspension compressed under her, the springs, old but functional, adjusted to a body different from the one now sitting on them. She found the foot controls, familiarized herself with their position without looking down. She had been riding since 1967. She had ridden machines in every state of repair and disrepair that a motorcycle could occupy. She understood intellectually that getting on this bike and riding it down the track was not mechanically different from the 10,000 other times she had gotten on a motorcycle. She also understood that it was completely different. She eased the clutch out. The Indian moved forward. Smooth. More smooth than she had expected from a machine this age. The clutch engagement progressive and forgiving in a way that spoke to the quality of the original engineering and the care with which it had been stored. She let it roll at walking speed across the clearing, getting the feel of the weight in motion, the way the center of gravity shifted under her as the gyroscopic effect of the wheels began to stabilize the frame. She turned a slow circle in the gravel, feeling the steering, the way the front wheel tracked and responded. The engine settled into a slightly higher idle as it warmed, the variations in the pulse becoming smaller and more regular. She rode toward the track. The dirt was firm and dry, the ruts from the previous week's traffic still visible in the surface. She kept the speed low, feeling the way the machine handled the uneven ground, the suspension working through the bars in a way she could read directly. The Indian did not fight her. It did not resist or require management in the way that some old machines do. Machines that have developed mechanical personalities over decades that must be negotiated rather than simply operated. It responded. It was responsive in the specific way of a well-made thing that has been properly maintained, and has not been neglected or mistreated, a thing that does what it was designed to do because its design was right and its condition has been preserved. She reached the end of the dirt track where it met the county road. She stopped, put her foot down, looked both ways along the asphalt. The road was empty in both directions, the pavement pale and flat in the pre-dawn light stretching away into the desert without a car or a light anywhere on it. She pulled out onto the road. She kept the speed moderate for the first quarter mile, still learning the machine, still cataloging its responses, and building the intuitive model that comes from direct experience and cannot be approximated by any amount of reading or observation. The Indian tracked straight and true at speed. The steering was heavier than a modern machine, requiring more input, but providing more information in return, telling her through the bars what the front wheel was encountering in the road surface, in a level of detail that modern steering geometry and tire technology had largely eliminated. Then the road opened up, a long, straight 3 miles of flat desert highway with nothing on either side but sagebrush and the pale rock of the low hills, and the enormous sky beginning to change in the east, the first real gray appearing above the ridgeline, the stars there fading. Nora opened the throttle. The Indian 4 accelerated with a directness that had nothing gradual or qualified about it. The engine sound changed, the irregular, idle rhythm replaced by the full-throated note of all 4 cylinders operating under load, a sound that went through her chest and into her sternum, and that she felt as much as heard. The cold air hit her helmet and jacket, and she leaned slightly forward over the bars and felt the speed press her back into the seat, the old leather creaking under her, the frame steady and certain beneath her, the machine doing what it had been built to do 88 years ago on roads that were rougher and less predictable than this one. She thought about Rosalind riding roads like this one in 1943, carrying things nobody was supposed to know about. Daytona 1937, Pikes Peak 1940, the New Mexico desert at night with classified documents in the saddlebag, and the whole dark landscape spread out around her, with nobody knowing what she was carrying or where she was going. What it cost to keep showing up when the world had organized opinions about whether you should not. The cost of one confrontation, but the sustained, accumulative weight of simply continuing year after year, mile after mile in silence. She rode for an hour. She rode until the sun fully cleared the eastern ridge and turned the desert from gray to gold to the particular clear brightness of an Arizona November morning. She rode until the cold in the air became something that moved through her rather than against her, until she and the machine and the road had established the relationship that only time and motion can create. She rode past places she had ridden 100 times on other bikes, and all of those times were present in the muscle memory of her hands and her body, but this time was different from all of them. This time was something else entirely. When she turned back and came up the county road and made the turn onto the dirt track and came up into the clearing, they were there. Hawk leaning against his Road King with his arms crossed and his coffee cup in one hand and his face doing its habitual work of giving away nothing. Ironside sitting on the running board of her truck with her own coffee, her silver hair loose this morning rather than braided. Cody standing at the edge of the clearing with his hands in the pockets of his jacket, not quite pretending he hadn't been watching for her the entire time she'd been gone. And Wren. Nora saw her daughter before she shut the engine down. Wren was standing apart from the others near the garage door, not quite with them, but not separate from them, either occupying the uncertain middle ground of someone who has arrived at a place and is not sure of her standing in it. She was thinner than Nora remembered. Older by more than 3 years older by the kind of years that have events in them rather than just time. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, and a quality to the way she was standing that Nora recognized as the posture of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally set it down and doesn't yet know how to stand without the weight. Nora had not known Wren was coming, but she understood as she shut the engine down and put the kickstand down and swung off the bike that Hawk had made a call 2 days ago, just 4 words sent to a number he'd kept all this time. Your mother's riding Sunday. He hadn't asked Wren to come. He hadn't needed to. Hawk walked over. He looked at her face the way he'd looked at it the morning he arrived with the Iron Maidens taking inventory. How was she? Nora pulled off her helmet. Her hair was matted and her face was flushed from the cold and the speed and something larger and less nameable than either. She said, "Good. She's really good." Hawk nodded. He looked at the Indian force standing in the clearing with its engine warm and a thin film of road dust on the chrome that hadn't been there an hour ago. He looked at it the way someone looks at evidence of something they'd been waiting to see confirmed. "Yeah," he said, "she is." Nora walked toward the garage. Wren hadn't moved. They looked at each other across the distance of the clearing, maybe 30 feet, maybe less. It felt like more. Wren was the first to speak. Her voice was quiet in the way of voices that have given up competing with ambient noise and are simply being directed at the specific person who needs to hear them. "Mom?" Nora stopped. She stood in the middle of the clearing and waited. Wren didn't move toward her. She stood where she was with her arms held slightly out from her sides, her hands open, the posture of someone who has put down everything they were carrying and is demonstrating that fact. "I saw the piece in the paper," Wren said, "about the garage, about what Grandma Rosalind left you, about the Smithsonian and all of it. I've been reading everything I could find since then." She paused. "I didn't know about any of it. What she did, what she built, what she left here." Nora said, "You didn't ask." Wren flinched, the small, precise flinch of someone absorbing a truth they can't argue with. "No." She said it without defense. "I didn't ask. I didn't know enough to know there was something to ask about." She reached into the canvas bag over her shoulder and took out an envelope. A regular business envelope sealed with a return address Nora didn't recognize in the upper left corner. "I have something," Wren said. "I need to give you something before I say anything else." She held it out. Nora walked forward and took it. The envelope contained documents, legal-sized pages folded in thirds. She opened them and read the first page, then the second. She stood in the clearing, reading in the morning sun while Wren waited. It was a notarized copy of the original loan agreement, the first one, the document that Rick Harlan had brought to Wren and that Wren had brought to Nora at the kitchen table in the spring of 2021. Except that this copy had annotations she had never seen on the original notations, in a different hand from Rick's along the margins and at the signature line. Below Nora's signature in a section she had not read when she signed it, because she had not read any of it. There was a clause about liability extension, and beside that clause was a marginal notation in Rick's handwriting that referenced a separate authorization document. The separate authorization document was attached as an exhibit. The signature on the exhibit was also in Nora's name. The handwriting was not Nora's handwriting. There was a signed affidavit from a forensic document examiner licensed in the state of Nevada, attesting to the discrepancy between the signatures. There was a signed statement from a notary in Reno who had witnessed Rick sign the authorization document. There was a date on the notary statement that was 3 weeks before the kitchen table meeting where Nora had signed the original loan application. Rick had prepared the forgery before he came to Wren with the loan proposal, before the conversation at Nora's kitchen table, before any of it. The authorization document he later used to access the additional lines of credit and the home equity had been created before he ever approached Wren. It took Nora a moment to fully understand what she was looking at. "Where did you get this?" she said. Wren said Rick kept copies of everything. He was that kind of careful. He had a storage unit in Henderson that he'd paid the rent on automatically from an account I didn't know about. When he left that account open by mistake. The automatic payment kept going out. I found the account 2 years after he was gone when I was going through old statements trying to figure out what else I might have missed. I found the storage unit. These were in a folder with my name on it." She paused. He kept records because he was afraid someone might contest the transactions later, and he wanted the documents to back up his version. But his version required these forgeries to be invisible. The fact that he kept them means he made a mistake. Nora looked at the documents in her hands. The debts she'd cleared with the Smithsonian proceeds were cleared. She didn't need this now to solve the immediate financial problem. But what these documents established, what they documented with notarized forensic precision, was that the liability she had carried for 2 years under her name had been created entirely by a fraudulent instrument that predated her participation in the transaction, which meant the legal exposure that had attached to her name was not hers by any defensible reading of the law. I had a lawyer in Phoenix look at them, Wren said. She said they're solid. She said you could use these to reopen the proceedings on the remaining credit judgments and potentially have them vacated. She said she'd take the case on a contingency basis because the documents are that clear. Nora folded the papers back into the envelope. She held it at her side. She looked at her daughter. 3 years. She said it without accusation, just as a statement of duration. Wren said, I know. You called once. I know, Mom. You said you'd fix it. You said you'd come back. Wren didn't look away. She stood there and absorbed it with the stillness of someone who has been preparing for this moment for a long time and has decided that preparation means absorbing what comes rather than deflecting it. I was ashamed, Wren said. I couldn't figure out how to come back when I hadn't fixed anything. And the longer I waited, the more impossible it seemed. And then I saw the piece in the paper, and I understood that you hadn't needed me to fix it. You'd done it. And I thought maybe the only thing I could do that meant anything was to bring you those documents. Nora looked at her daughter. She looked at the lines around Wren's eyes and the hollows in her face, and the open-handed posture she'd taken up like a person who has set down something they'd been carrying until it started to cost them more than whatever they'd imagined it was protecting. She thought about what Rosalind had written in the letter. The Callahan women have always been hard on themselves and easy on the people who hurt them. She thought about whether that was true. She thought about the specific difficulty of standing in this clearing with these documents in her hand and her daughter in front of her, and the Indian Four behind her, and the garage with Rosalind's name over the door, and whether any of it pointed toward a particular response. It didn't. Nothing pointed. Some things had to be decided without pointing. Come inside, Nora said. There's coffee. Wren stared at her. What? There's a pot on the workbench. It's probably still hot. Wren's mouth open-closed. She said, I don't understand. I'm not forgiving you, Nora said. Not yet. Maybe not for a while. But you came back and you brought me something real, and you stood there and took what I said without making excuses for yourself. That's more than I expected. She turned and walked toward the garage. She did not look back to see if Wren was following, but she heard the footsteps in the gravel behind her, uncertain at first, and then steadier, and she held the door open without turning around. Hawk stayed until noon. Ironside until later than that. Cody stayed because he always stayed because the shop had become the place where his days organized themselves, and leaving it at a reasonable hour was not something he had developed a habit of. They sat on the porch outside the garage, Nora and Wren with their coffee, not saying much. The morning moved around them. The sun climbed and the air warmed, and the desert transitioned from its cold early clarity to the full brightness of a November day in Arizona, sharp and clean and without humidity. Wren asked about the Indian Four, about the races, the trophies, the journal. Nora told her. Not everything, not all at once, but the shape of it, the outline of a life that had existed in complete privacy for decades on this hillside, and that had left everything it contained for a granddaughter who arrived at the right moment by the longest and most difficult available route. Wren listened without interrupting. At the end, she was quiet for a moment, looking up at the sky. She was protecting it, Wren said. Rosalind. All those years. She was keeping it safe until there was someone who needed it enough to use it right. Nora thought about that. She thought it was probably more complicated than that, and also probably exactly that simple. She said she was protecting it and she was waiting. I think she always knew the right person would get here eventually. Wren looked at her. She didn't say what Nora thought she might say, something about whether she herself was the wrong person, whether her presence here now was something she'd forfeited the right to. She just looked, and something in the look asked a question she wasn't quite ready to put into words. You can stay, Nora said, if you need to. The storage room isn't large, but there's a bed in it, and I wasn't using the space for anything that mattered. Ren shook her head. I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking. I'm telling you the room is available. There's a difference. Why? Nora set her coffee cup down on the porch rail. Because you're my daughter, and you came back and bringing those documents here was harder than leaving would have been. Because your grandmother's letter says the Callahan women have always been hard on themselves and easy on people who hurt them, and I've been thinking about that for 2 months. And I've decided it means we need to learn the difference between being easy on someone and giving them the opportunity to show you who they are now rather than who they were. She picked up the coffee cup again. And because I need help in the shop, real help, not charity work. If you stay, you work. Ren looked at her for a long time. She said, I don't know anything about motorcycles. Nora said nobody does when they start. The weeks that followed were the way beginnings always are awkward and effortful, and without the fluency that only comes from time. Ren moved into the storage room and showed up at the garage every morning and swept floors and organized parts and made the coffee runs and stayed out of the way of people who were doing things she didn't yet know how to do. She asked questions and listened carefully to the answers and forgot things and was told again and asked again and gradually stopped forgetting. She and Nora moved around each other with the deliberate care of people navigating something fragile, something that could be broken by too much weight applied in the wrong place at the wrong time. They did not have the conversations that should have happened. Not yet. There was a sequence to things, and the sequence required that some time passed before certain exchanges were possible. But things happened in the space between the conversations they weren't having. Ren stayed late one evening when everyone else had gone and cleaned the workbench surfaces with a thoroughness that went well beyond what Nora had asked for, stripping off the accumulated grime of months of work and revealing wood underneath that Nora had forgotten was a particular color. She did it without saying anything about it and didn't mention it the next morning. Nora noticed. Cody took Ren under his instruction after the first week in the unconscious way that he absorbed and distributed knowledge showing her how to clean parts properly, how to sort hardware by type and size, how to read a parts diagram. He was 16 years old, and he explained things with the patience of someone who understood that knowledge is simply something you pass on when you have it, and someone else doesn't, and that's all it is. After a month, Nora put Ren to work on something real. A carburetor from a 1949 panhead disassembled and spread across a clean cloth on the secondary bench. Not the most complex rebuild they did, but not trivial either, a job that required attention to the sequence of reassembly and clean hands and the patience to do each step correctly before moving to the next one. It took Ren 6 hours. Nora watched from across the shop without appearing to watch the way she had always monitored work from a distance, available if needed, present without hovering. Ren made mistakes. She had to disassemble a section twice when she realized she'd gotten a gasket orientation wrong. She asked Cody twice, cast once, and came to Nora 3 times with questions she framed carefully, demonstrating that she had thought about the problem before bringing it to her. When she was done, she held the assembled carburetor up and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Nora. Will it work? Nora walked over and took it. She turned it in her hands, examined the external assembly, looked at the float bowl seating and the jet positioning and the choke mechanism. She found 2 small errors, things that would not cause immediate failure, but that would eventually cause problems. Things that a person learns to catch after they've made them once and understood why they mattered. Put it in, Nora said. Ren's hands were not steady as she installed the carburetor on the test bike on the secondary bench. She connected the fuel line and the throttle cable and the choke cable, checking each connection twice before moving to the next. Cody stood at the end of the bench and watched without intervening because this was hers to do. Nora primed the fuel system and kicked the bike over. The engine caught on the second kick and ran clean. Not perfect, the 2 small errors Nora had spotted would show up after extended running, but clean in the way that mattered. For this moment, the way that confirmed the fundamental assembly was correct. Ren didn't move. She stood with her hands at her sides, looking at the running engine. The expression on her face was something Nora recognized not from watching her daughter, but from the inside. From her own experience of the first time she had done something mechanical correctly and heard the confirmation of it in the sound of the machine. I did that, Ren said. She said it quietly, not to anyone in particular. Nora let the engine run for another 30 seconds and then shut it off. Yeah, she said. You did. It was the first time in 4 years she had felt something approaching pride when looking at her daughter. She didn't say that. Some things communicate better without being said, and this was one of them, and Ren knew it, which was visible in the way she exhaled and turned away briefly to give herself a moment. By spring, Ren had moved into a small apartment in town, a one-bedroom above a hardware store that was within her budget, given what Nora was now paying her a wage that was modest but real, because real pay meant real work, and real work meant this was something rather than charity, which was the distinction that mattered to both of them. She kept coming to the shop every morning. She was not going to be a master mechanic that was clear and honest, and not a failing, but she had become something better suited to what she actually was. A person who understood the work and could do a significant range of it competently, and who kept the operational side of the workshop organized and functional in ways that freed Nora and Cody and Cass and Petra and Lou to focus on the technical work. The workshop had become something larger than Nora had designed it to be. A woman named Tessa Brandt rode up from Tucson one afternoon on a road-dusted Sportster and said she'd heard about the shop and wanted to work there not as a customer, as a mechanic. She was in her early 30s with scarred hands that told their own story and a directness of manner that Nora recognized as the quality of someone who has learned through experience that clarity is more efficient than social performance. Nora told her to come back in the morning and show her what she knew. Tessa came back at 7 the next morning, and Nora put her to work on a diagnostic problem. She'd been saving a 1947 knucklehead with an intermittent electrical issue that had defeated 2 other mechanics before the owner had brought it in. Tessa found the fault in 40 minutes of failing connection in the primary wiring harness that only presented under specific temperature and vibration conditions. She didn't announce it. She fixed it and wrote up what she'd found in clear, precise language on the work order form. Nora hired her the same afternoon. A young man named Danny Voss came a month after that, Ironside's nephew, with the ability to rewire a complete electrical system from the ground up, and a patience with intricate work that Nora found she didn't have to cultivate in him because it was already there. He joined without ceremony and fit into the operation as though the space had been waiting for him. The shop ran. It ran with the quality of a place where the people doing the work understand what the work is for, not just mechanically but in the larger sense. They were taking machines that were irreplaceable and restoring them to function, which meant that every decision about how to do the work was a decision about what would survive into the future, and people who understood that brought a different quality of care to their hands. One morning in late March, Nora came into the garage and found Cody standing in front of the Indian 4. He was 17 now. The year and a half she had known him had changed him in the way that time changes someone at that age when they're spending it doing real work rather than waiting for their life to begin. He was taller and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who has learned a significant number of difficult things and integrated them. He was looking at the Indian with the particular expression he got when he was thinking about something that mattered. "You okay?" she asked. He turned. "Yeah, just thinking about your grandmother, about what she built here, about what you're building." Nora walked over and stood beside him. "She left you something substantial," he said. "She did. And you've done right by it." They stood there in the silence of the garage, the two of them with the Indian 4 in front of them, and the trophies on the walls and the photographs, and the whole accumulated weight of a life that had been lived in complete privacy for decades, and that had managed to matter anyway, to persist anyway, to arrive eventually at the hands of someone who could understand what it was. Cody reached into his jacket pocket and took out the brass key. Nora had given it to him 5 months ago, the morning she'd first ridden the Indian, the morning she'd come back into the clearing and seen them all standing there waiting. She had taken it from around her neck and placed it in his palm, and he had understood all of it without requiring explanation. He held it out to her now. "I think it's time you gave this to someone else," he said. Nora looked at the key, at his face. "You've earned it," she said. "That key is yours." He shook his head. It's not about earning, he said. Your grandmother knew that. You knew that when you gave it to me. It gets passed on. That's what it is. He pressed it into her palm. You'll know when. He went back to the transmission he'd been rebuilding at the other end of the bench and didn't mention it again. Nora stood with the key in her hand for a while. She looked at the Indian 4. She was going to take it out this morning. That had been the plan. The air was clear and the temperature was right. And she had a road in mind she hadn't ridden in 5 years that ran north through the hills and eventually came out on the high desert plateau where you could see 100 miles in 3 directions on a clear day. She walked out to the porch and found Wren there with 2 cups of coffee. Wren held one out. Nora took it. They stood on the porch in the morning light. You ever ridden? Nora asked. Wren shook her head. You want to learn? Wren looked at her. Really look the way people look when they're not sure whether the thing being offered is actually being offered? Really, Nora said. She walked Wren over to the Panhead, the 1948 they'd restored 8 months ago. Smaller and lighter than the Indian, with a forgiving clutch. And a character that Nora had noticed was patient with uncertainty in a way that not all old iron managed to be. She went through the basics. How to sit, how the weight of the machine wanted to be balanced rather than fought, how the clutch engaged, and how to feel for the friction point rather than looking for it. How the throttle responded and why smooth was always the answer when you weren't sure. Wren stalled it 3 times trying to get it into first gear. On the 4th attempt, it rolled forward 5 miles an hour, slow and wobbling in a curving line across the clearing that was not straight but was upright, which was the only thing that mattered at this stage. She was grinning when she came back around. Nora handed her a helmet. Follow us, she said. Stay back. Don't try to keep up, just ride. She went inside and wheeled the Indian out. Hawk had arrived while she was talking to Wren, pulling into the clearing on his old Road King with Ironside behind him. Cody came out and got on the Hydroglide he'd finished rebuilding in January, which he had ridden now for 3 months, with the ease of someone for whom mechanical fluency was simply the natural state of things. They rode out together, Nora on the Indian 4, Hawk on the Road King, Ironside on her Softail, Cody on the Hydroglide, Wren on the Panhead 50 yards behind them, all finding her balance, finding her speed, finding what it felt like to have an engine between her legs and a road in front of her, and nothing required of her in this moment except to keep going. Nora led them north through the hills and out onto the high desert highway, past the rock formations and the dry arroyos and the long sweeping curves she knew from decades of riding this particular stretch of Arizona. The morning air was cold and clean, and the sky was enormous and unobstructed in every direction. She opened the throttle. The Indian answered without a moment's hesitation. The engine note rose and the speed built, and the road dissolved into a continuity of forward motion that had no particular end because the destination had never been the point. The point was this: the road and the machine and the engine doing what it was built to do, and the person on it doing the same. She thought about Rosalind at 29, at Daytona at 32, at Pikes Peak at 35, carrying classified documents through the New Mexico desert in the dark, with the whole landscape spread out around her, and nobody anywhere on the pavement knowing what she was carrying or where she was going. She thought about what it had cost to do all of it, the racing and the courier work, and the 40 years of quiet accumulation afterward, collecting pieces of history that nobody else understood while the world went about its business around her without noticing. The particular kind of strength that doesn't announce itself because it has nothing to prove to anyone watching. 2 hours out and back. The sun had climbed fully by the time they came up the dirt track and into the clearing. The air had warmed the cold, burned off the desert at its late morning best, clear and still and luminous. Wren pulled in last and shut her engine down and sat on the Panhead for a moment without getting off. She took off her helmet, her face was flushed and her eyes were very bright. That was incredible, she said. She said it to no one, specifically to the air, the way you say a thing when you're still inside the experience of it and haven't quite come back yet. Yeah, Nora said. It is. They walked back into the garage together. Inside, everyone was already at work. Cody at the bench, Cass at the torch in the back corner, the blue arc of her flame lighting the space around her. Petra on the phone with a customer, Lou going through the week's schedule on the clipboard she kept by the door, Tessa under a knucklehead with her feet sticking out and the radio on low, Danny at the secondary bench with a wiring harness spread across the surface like a diagram of something intricate and essential. They moved through their routines with the ease of people who had stopped needing to think about where they belonged. Nora poured herself coffee and stood in the doorway and looked at all of it. This was what Rosalind had built, she thought. Not just the garage, not just the collection, not just the Indian 4 or the trophies or the journal or the medals in their velvet pouch. This, the ongoing thing, the thing that continued past any single person's tenure in it, that took in broken machinery and people who didn't fit anywhere else and applied the same principle to both, which was that function could be restored if you understood what something was built for and were willing to do the patient, unglamorous work of getting it back there. Wren came and stood beside her. They looked at the garage together. The Indian 4 on its platform in the center of the room. Road dust on the chrome, now the dust of actual miles. The trophies on their shelves. The photographs on the wall, Rosalind's face in every one young and alive, and absolutely certain of the things she was doing. Mom, Wren said. Nora looked at her. Thank you. For what? Wren looked at the garage, at the people in it, at the Indian 4, at the sign over the door visible through the open bay. Rosalind Callahan Workshop, established 1946. The letters clear in the morning sun. For not closing the door, Wren said. Nora thought about that for a moment. Your grandmother left it open, she said. I just walked through it. Someday you'll leave something open for someone else. That's what it was for. Wren nodded. She wiped her eyes without making anything of it. They went inside. Nora walked to the Indian 4 and stood in front of it for a moment, not touching it, just letting herself feel the fact of the morning. The ride, the road dust on the chrome, the key in her jacket pocket that would find its next hand when the time was right. These things announced themselves. Rosalind had known that. She herself had known it when she placed the key in Cody's palm. She would know it again. She went to the workbench. Cody, she said, show me what you're working on. He walked her through it. The problem, the diagnosis, the solution, the steps taken. She listened and asked questions and listened to the answers. He was doing it right. He was doing it with the full attention of someone who understood what the work was for not just today, but in the longer sense, the sense that connected this bench to the one her grandmother had built in 1946, and to every bench that would follow this one. Good, she said. Keep going. She picked up a wrench and went to work beside him. Outside, the desert held its silence the way it always did, patient and vast and indifferent to the difficulties of the people moving through it. The sun climbed higher. The day got hotter. The sign over the door caught the light and held it. Inside the garage, the work continued. It had been what it was for a long time before anyone understood it, and it would go on being what it was long after the people in it today had moved on and passed whatever they knew to the next set of hands. That was the nature of it. That was what Rosalind had understood when she sat down in August of 1998 with a pen and a piece of cream stationery and wrote a letter to a granddaughter she loved enough to leave waiting. The Indian 4 stood in the center of it all. It had been what it was for a long time. It would go on being what it was. A machine built to run, ridden by women who understood that some roads don't end, they just pass through different hands. Ready for the next mile, as it had always been, as it would always be.